You've discovered the Technoprogressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. Matteo. Matteo and I have been teaching, Matteo has been teaching our Technoprogressive Worldbuilding course for the last 5 weeks. And we wanted to do a brief episode about what the topics are that we're addressing in the course, invite people to participate in the course, and then talk a little bit about the generative thoughts that the course has stimulated for Matteo in terms of the philosophy of technoprogressivism. But first, why don't we do a real introduction of you, Matteo, since you're the instructor here. How did you get interested in this neck of the woods for these ideas?
Well, that's a good question. It, in some sense, as soon as I began to study emerging technologies or really become interested in them, it struck me that there was the progressive potential of these technologies. That's not always realized, obviously. There's lots of ways it can be regressive, but as soon as I heard about the possibilities, some years ago, you know, I've always known about technology, of course, I grew up with it, but I became specifically interested in it in college, and I started to read more about emerging technologies and the philosophy of technology and the history of technology, and to think about the transformations that have already happened and the ways that it has changed society and the way that society um, led people to invent certain things or to go down one road and not another road, and why different societies developed in slightly different directions, and why societies often eventually converge and then, at certain points and then diverge at other points. So in studying all that, I, saw a kind of fluidity in the way that technology develops and the way that it can be steered. And that was just sort of I don't know, maybe a first principles kind of view. And then I didn't see a lot written on that idea of what now I can, now I associate with technoprogressivism. I hadn't heard the term, and I guess at that time it wasn't yet coined, but the when I came across, your book, Citizen Cyborg, which is probably like 15 years ago or so. Um, and I was reading the Democratic Transhumanist Wikipedia page at that time, and I actually on my Facebook profile, where it says politics, I put Democratic Transhumanist, and then it was like, oh, that doesn't exist as a category. So now you are the person who runs this page. And for several years, I ran that page, although I didn't do that much with it, but 1,000 people followed it. And
Fascinating.
yeah, Facebook has now deleted it for some reason. I have no idea why. I didn't delete it. But I started talking to people in transhumanist circles, and I kind of felt out the contours, and the libertarian school didn't make a lot of sense to me because I felt like there needed to be some democratic direction, and libertarianism can often fall in undemocratic or, authoritarian directions, despite I do like the social libertarian ideas that are purported, but I often find without any kind of democratic institutions, those ideas are often, sidelined for economic and a really an economic school of thinking, like classical liberalism, kind of substitutes for the democratic liberalism, the liberal democracy. And that didn't strike me as a way to develop technology in a positive direction. And I felt like it could actually be used in a quite negative direction. I didn't yet know about surveillance capitalism or Peter Thiel and, neo-reactionary thought or any of that, but it was unfolding at the time. And, again, after I started reading about it, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That people who just leave everything to what they consider to be a free market or a free society, if there's already groups of powerful people and elites that already control many of these systems and technologies and institutions, that will actually not be a free society. And it will most likely tend toward an undemocratic form. So, yeah, that got me further interested, and I started reading more about technoprogressivism and following IEET's work. And then, you know, after a while, I had long wanted to start a podcast and a blog and other things, and so I started it, and then we met right almost right at the beginning of, just a
Mhm.
couple weeks after I launched it. So,
I was very excited to discover your podcast and your work. Um, and it's been fantastic to talk to somebody who has a similar interest in the kind of deep theory and deep history of these ideas. And the course itself is an attempt to go through some of that history. We we didn't do a lot so far on the Enlightenment, but that's usually where I start the story. I like rooting all of these ideas in essays like Condorcet's "Progress of the Future of the Human Mind,"
mhm.
where he French revolutionary who advocated for longevism as well as getting rid of work. But you started pretty much with a discussion of Bogdanov. Tell us who Bogdanov was.
Yeah, we actually started with your book, right?
Oh,
And
we start with Susan
and the
Simon.
Techno-Progressive Declaration.
That's right. That's right.
And then, but yes, the first like kind of deep theory that we dug into was Bogdanov's book, The Philosophy of Living Experience, which is actually the popular version of a set of essays on the nature and purpose of philosophy and how philosophy interacts with, human struggle, progress, and like the th theories of change and how we should organize and develop society. So those are called there's a bunch of essays. There's a collection of essays actually you can get on Haymarket. There's called Imperial Monism, but that's a very there's a very technical collection of essays, and he kind of he decided that it was, that was really not going to speak to the popular people who are interested in labor organizing at that time. And instead, he should do a kind of history of philosophy and situate imperial monism. And at the end, a theory which eventually became the basis of cybernetics called techtology, which he called the universal science of organization. He was trying to develop a systems theory that would discover the underlying principles that connect all disciplines of knowledge together to create effectively something similar to like a unified, similar to like in physics, you have the unified field theory that is like the holy grail of theoretical physics. He was trying to unify all different forms of knowledge by understanding how they organize human thought and action.
Hmm.
So, how do we, and effectively because he wanted to be able to apply the methods of one field of knowledge to other fields of knowledge and to integrate various methods, not according to a discipline, but according to whatever question was at hand. So that methods would be freed from these silos of knowledge, these containers like, this is molecular biology and this is, astrophysics, and to kind of free those methods from those containers and say like any method can be used by any person depending on what the question requires. So, you know, we can use, and he gives the example of all these different discoveries that were made by people who applied methods from one field to another. So he gives the example of like Darwin was applying, Malthus's theory to biology in order to come up with natural selection. And so that was an economic theory, really about, understanding food production, and he gives the kind of somewhat he's kind of critical of Malthus, but he gives like the he comes up with the idea that Malthus had this theory of the survival of the fittest, which, he sees it as somewhat negative, but then he tries to think about that and he applies it to biology, and he's looking at the ways in which, animals are competing for scarce resources, and he actually separates humans out, and says, well, humans are actually able to develop cooperation in a way that's different from other animals, but other people, which is important for the history of transhumanism, argued that humans are very similar to other animals, and so survival of the fittest applies to humans, not based on like these kind of purely evolutionary characteristics, but also based on social characteristics. And so there's a kind of social Darwinism, and those people who are in positions of power already are in those positions of power because, you know, they deserve to be in those positions of power. They fought for that. Their families are stronger or smarter. And there's a biological component to that. So it's sociobiological. And that led to the theory of eugenics, which is typically, as you know, we'll go into when we talk about transhumanism, but that's like one of the main critiques of transhumanism, which is that it's actually a form of eugenics. But yeah, he was trying to free these methods so that human progress and intellectual and knowledge, like the progress of knowledge, could be advanced by not siloing people and tying them to one theory, tying them to one set of methods that belong to, you know, a university department, or like, the British Royal Society or whoever else like determines what gets researched and how it gets researched. That's a way to limit human potential. And he argues that it's much better if we were able to free all these methods from each other. And why I brought it up in the course is because he was really trying to think about how technology develops often according to this, like, people crossing these different boundaries and making these great discoveries by being kind of heretical to the methods of their fields. And, he gives the example of Copernicus and various other people. Most of the people that we would consider like the great uh, leaders of science and technologies, like, these were all the heretics of their field. And so he wanted to create a heretical theory of systems that would enable us to kind of embrace that and develop more rapidly by understanding that this potential exists as a kind of social possibility, but it's kept at bay because of the way the market works and because of the way everybody exists in their own company, in their own university, and et cetera, their own institutions.
He comes to our attention because he was an advocate. He was a part of a group called the God Builders, that were dissident Bolsheviks, non-Leninist Bolsheviks, and they in general were advocates for version of cosmism, correct? That they wanted to apply the socialist revolution not only to liberating people socially, but also unleashing the means of production and allowing us all to live very long lives and transforming the human body and so forth. So he was kind of a proto-transhumanist in that regard.
Yeah, he was definitely a proto-transhumanist, and he was one of the inventors of the blood transfusion. He led the Blood Transfusion Institute, and one of his very interesting theories, which is now being proven true, um, by a very, by actually, there's experiments now with Brian Johnson, a very not Bolshevik communist type of person, a
Can we,
millionaire.
can we just digress about Brian Johnson for a second?
Yeah.
I mean, he's a rich guy. I don't have sympathy for rich guys in general, but people keep asking me what I think about Brian Johnson. It's like he's a guy who has made public all of his efforts to extend his own life.
Hmm.
And he also made public the fact that 2 weeks ago he was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder that he's probably had for decades that had nothing to do with the treatments that he was giving himself, these life extension
Right.
treatments, except that they may have they may have helped in some way. We don't know. But people immediately jumped on him. It's like, ha ha, you were trying to live a long time, but you're actually going to die of something that you don't have any control over. It's like, what is with the glee that people had about Brian Johnson? It's, I mean, it is kind of techno progressive that people are mad about billionaires doing things that are only for billionaires. And some of the treatments, like this, getting blood transfusions from his son, we're not, the ordinary person doesn't have the ability to, get their kids to donate blood to them. But it's like, come on, he was doing it as transparently and openly as we want. And we don't know what all the other billionaires are doing. They're probably doing the same thing behind closed doors.
I don't have anything specifically against Brian Johnson. I mean, yeah, like we can critique the society that, enables some people to have access to, radical but also unproven technologies um, over others. And, there's also critiques which are raised by Johnson and others about, how much can we or should we be able to experiment with our own bodies? And, there's good arguments on both sides of that. There's good reason why the medical establishment is conservative. I mean, it's very easy to kill yourself by experimenting with your body. And the body is quite robust and strong and adaptable, but also fragile, right? It's if you mess up the equilibrium of your body just a little bit, you could kill yourself or get very sick, poison yourself, and so there's a reason why we don't want people to just be experimenting on themselves endlessly and having all this unnecessary suffering. But the other argument is like a type of bioliberalism or freedom that you can say, biohacking is sort of your right? You have a right to control your own body and, including the right to harm yourself if, not, including the right to harm yourself with various things that we know are not good for you. Like people do this, of course, with smoking cigarettes and, you know, regular drinking of alcohol, the use of various drugs. Um, all kinds of other things, eating foods that are not good for you, etc. Even though there's lots of data that shows these things are not good, we don't ban them. Although sometimes we do ban drugs of various kinds.
When
But the
when
argument of bioliberalism is that we shouldn't ban it because you have a right to your own body.
yeah.
And only if it destroys society in a way that, it's hard because it's an abstract or kind of it's an arbitrary line. Like when does social harm, when can we consider it social harm, right?
Yeah.
I mean, certainly it harms some people that people drink alcohol. Like, and if you get in arguments with people and you fight with people or you get in a car accident because you're driving drunk or, you know, you lose your job because you're day drinking and then your family suffers because of that, right? That's the argument behind the temperance movement, which is that alcohol harms society. And there's very good evidence that it does. But at what threshold should we say this is something that you have the liberty to do? And these are known harmful substances, right? Or at least they're harmful above a certain threshold.
The,
That's
the,
not always clear.
this is actually the topic of the next prosthetic gods that Nira and I are going to do is on the right to try, which is ordinarily refers to liberalizing the access that people who are terminally ill might have to
Right.
treatments, and where you can't really argue that it's going to cause social harm because they're dying anyway, and why shouldn't they be able to try whatever they want? Um, but I think more generally, now that we've seen this deregulatory push of the federal the Trump administration around peptides and the importation of unapproved peptides and the use of compounding pharmacies to produce things that haven't been approved by the FDA, there is the kind of generalization of the argument, as you say. And it's actually where, when I teach health policy, it's one of the fundamental arguments I start with. I say, look, there's a fundamental contradiction between, as you say, our right to control our own bodies and the society's obligation to make sure that people have informed consent when they do that. And to get informed consent, you need to require that everything go through a clinical testing regime so that you can tell people what the actual benefits and downsides are of anything they're going to take. Um, and I think a lot of students, need to work their way up from there. Why do we have an FDA in the first place? Why do we have regulation of alcohol and tobacco, as you say? And does it make any sense the way that we're regulating those things? Because the harms of alcohol and tobacco are far greater than the harms of, deregulated ADHD medication or whatever. But okay, let's go back to the course. So Marxist and socialist Prometheism, we started with that. Then we
Yeah.
we started with Citizen Cyborg and the Technoprogressive Declaration. Then some Marxist ideas about this. And then we moved into design justice. So algorithmic. Who wrote design justice again?
Sasha Costanza-Chock.
Yeah. And so the idea is that there's a politics of design, and that technoprogressivism would be, centrally interested in this politics of design.
Right. Yeah. Design justice is really first, it's of course, a critique of unjust designs of various kinds. And um Sasha goes into lots of examples of those, like how various things are designed that harm some groups of people specifically over others. And that can be considered specific depending on your social class, your gender, your race, nationality, etc. So some designs are not even visible to certain groups of people. Usually we would say like the dominant group or the people who are considered the, you know, effectively whenever, politicians are talking about the average voter or something, right? Like the median group of people who they direct their talking toward, which are typically, you know, not children, not necessarily, very old people, mostly white or white adjacent people, or people who are people of color, but they're of a particular education level or income level. Um, and they're going, most of it is geared toward men, etc. Right? Like it's a kind of certain archetype of who the real American is like, when you think of the direct political center of the United States, unlike, you know, CNN and, centrist Democrats and moderate Republicans, not MAGA per se. But when they direct their message, who are they directing it toward? And that kind of group of people would be considered more or less the dominant group. They're not like the ruling class, right? That's not what I mean, but like they are typically like considered the average person. So then there's all these other people who have disabilities, people who are very old or their children, or they might have intersectional identities that are typically associated with injustice, like they're poor and black, or they're gay and black, or they might be undocumented, but they might also be trans, various other things. And those people are typically not considered in design choices, and actually often design is specifically meant to exclude them, or at least no one or most people are not thinking about the ways design could exclude them by simply using the data that reinforces the idea that there's like one type of average person. And you can kind of see this all over, so there's various examples in different domains. One of the classic examples given is like, well, typically in the design of cities, they're not typically thinking of single mothers with children, or what they call people who, what do they call them? People who have encumbered movement, I think is the typical phrase. And so cities are full of technologies of all kinds, right? They're like a city is really a complex of technologies. It's a living system of various different types of technologies. But, the when you think about something like the entrance to a subway, some subways have elevators. Sometimes those elevators are out of service. They often, if you've ever taken the elevators in any given city, they're often they don't smell very nice, and they're dark and they feel a bit threatening, and you can imagine how a single mother with like three children feels when she goes on this elevator and she's trying to keep a handle on them. Or you have a stroller and then you have two other kids who might run away and you're trying to go down like a bunch of steps. Or you're on the and then when you get down to the platform, there's a gap between the platform and the train where the kids could fall in. And you're trying to keep them wrangled while you're trying to like drop them off at daycare, which is maybe not where, and then you're trying to get to work on time, right? So there's all these different ways in which the design of these systems was not considering a person like that, even though those people are actually quite numerous. And
Whenever I think about this issue of design justice, I think about John Brunner's 1975 novel, The Shockwave Rider.
hmm,
And it's notable because it is the first instance, I think, in science fiction of a proposal for a computer worm. And the worm is designed and unleashed by a guy who has a name that's 32 characters long, but all the computer systems in the world only accept 30 characters for a name field. And so his name is always being truncated, and as a consequence, he keeps having problems with authenticating his identity in that future world that it purports. But I thought
yeah,
that novel was so prescient when it came out. I mean, I didn't realize how prescient it was until the '90s when we actually had an internet and
right.
and those issues came around. But he was imagining what it would be like to be a person who falls between the cracks of the assumed normal in an internet world.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's another example. So she gives the example also, like you're saying, of on the internet, initially many platforms had like, man, woman as like the drop downs on the menu. And if you're trans or you're non-binary, you don't have an option. You have to choose one of these options. And so your identity is automatically determined or sort of constrained by by the design of the platform. And usually this is said to be the affordances and disaffordances of a design. So it affords you to be one of these two things, and it disaffords you. It doesn't allow you to be other things. Now we see on some platforms you could choose non-binary, gender non-conforming, you can choose trans, trans masculine, trans feminine, etc. There's many different things that you can include, or you can type it in yourself and self-identify. Same thing was a big problem in some other sites, and this was initially a big problem on dating sites, was just like you could really only be single on a dating site, even though not everybody was technically single. Or you could say like, you know, typically like the drop down might say like single or married, right?
Male,
Now,
male or female.
or in a relationship, single, married, right? Which is like, which of course also has a sort of hierarchy to it. Single is the least valid if you're above a certain age. It's valid if you're below a certain age, and if you're 11, it's valid. But if you're like, 29, 38, not so valid. In a relationship is like, yeah, okay. So you're like a teenager, but you're really 45. So, okay, you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Well, that's pretty serious for a person your age. There's already an assumption built into it of a kind of normativity that a person should be married, and you know, you can say also has kids, doesn't have kids, right? Well, that doesn't tell you anything about whether the person wants kids, tried to have kids and can't have kids because of infertility or, various other things. Like it only affords you these kind of binary or maybe a few different choices, and that's determined often by who is designing it and what the purpose of that platform is. but it filters out people who don't meet those criteria. And that's like all across platforms that that sort of thing happens. And you had given the example in our course of the census, like you could choose white, Asian, black,
Before
you know,
2010, yeah, the census and every federal document required that you have a mutually exclusive choice of what your ethnicity was. And then
mhm.
after 2010, they decided that you could have multiple ethnic identities. And it started to roll the people who had multiples up into multi-ethnicity or multiracial. And yeah, when I point that out to people, how recently that was, and the politics around it, it's like, and which ones do you then include? The way that it's currently constructed, you ask about Hispanic first, because Hispanic is that they argued, and I think they're correct, that it's not a race, it's an ethnic category. But then if you're Hispanic, you get carved out as Hispanic, and it doesn't make any difference if you say that you're black, white, or whatever. But if you say you're not Hispanic and then you say you're black and white, then you're multiracial. So it's like, how did we come up with these categories? Because that's where, we did a survey actually in when was it? In the 2000s, we did a survey of neighborhood in Hartford. And we went around and asked people, according to the previous categories, which was Hispanic was a racial category before 2010. And we asked people in Hartford if what their race was, what their ethnicity was first. Are they Hispanic or not? And then they would say, I'm Hispanic or not. And then we would ask them their race, and Hispanic would be a category there. And they'd say, well, I already told you that my race is Hispanic. And it's like, well, yeah, but you also can have these other racial categories. Anyway, most people still don't understand where all this comes from.
Yeah, it's like, of course it's historically constructed, and to go back like to Bogdanov, that's what he would argue that like, all of this is just a matter of is a matter of crystallizing some form of social experience. Like there was a history in which it made sense to categorize people in some particular way because of the way society worked. And the United States created the category of Hispanic in order to deal with the problem, well, what people at the time considered a problem of dealing with the people who occupied Texas, New Mexico, um, effectively the American Southwest, California, and the way in which if in the way in which statehood was organized at the time, which is that it was a territory, considered a territory, effectively a colony, until a certain point at which more than half of the population were considered to be American, which implied a white settler. But this was a big problem for after the Mexican-American War because then they were like, okay, there are many people who are in Mexico, or what was then Mexico before the Mexican-American War, that are really actually white. Um, and they're really Spanish. So are Spanish people white or are they
Mhm.
not white?
Right.
And
A
if we
debate we've
consider,
had with about the Irish that we're having
yeah,
now about Arabs. Yeah, exactly.
it was a big problem for them because they're like the people who did the census at the time were like, if we consider these people to be white, which they were not, they didn't understand that the people who were from Mexico didn't understand that category. They didn't, it made no sense to them. There was a kind of discourse about being Hispanic that was really important to people in Mexico at the time to differentiate themselves from what we would call like indigenous Mexicans, people who were mostly Mixtec or Olmec, various other indigenous groups, which were often mixed, of course. They were often mixed with people who were European, and so there was all this. You're really indigenous culturally in Mexico if you associate and you follow the culture of these various groups rather than it being kind of a blood quantum the way we do it in the United States, which is highly critiqued and
Absolutely. Yeah.
is
132nd rule wasn't that the Supreme Court's decision in
yeah,
the
the one
18th
drop
century?
rule.
One drop rule. Yeah.
Yes. But that determined like with the question of what Hispanic meant and how it would be interpreted by the United States. Like do we take the Mexican definition of Hispanic, or is Hispanic something foreign? Like if it's considered under white, which eventually it was for a long time considered a form of whiteness, even though they were also discriminated against for various other reasons, then it can count toward the number of people in the statehood count. We can
Hmm.
consider them to be settlers, right? Because effectively, if we take the settler identity as it stood in Mexico, which actually has a totally different history than the United States, because the development of Mexico was actually quite different, and the way that indigenous and European people interacted in Mexico has a totally different history than the way it happened in the US. But if we just adopt the Mexican definition, then we can say these people are settlers, and therefore Texas can become a state.
Right.
If we don't
Well,
accept that, Texas is the frontier, and it
well,
cannot become a state.
it's also contemporarily relevant. France is a country that does not permit racial questions on their census, and I think in any federal document, you're not allowed to ask people's race. And one of the consequences is that they don't have the same kind of statistics that we do about representation. And so here in the States, and at least until we got rid of DEI, if that's what we did, um, we would use underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in various occupations or educational institutions or whatever as evidence that there might be a problem. And when we went from having unique categories of ethnic self-identification to having multiracial, there was a concern. The NAACP was concerned that the proportion of Americans who identified as Black would go down because a lot of Black people actually do have mixed race ancestry for very, very complicated reasons. Um, Rape and slavery, basically. And so, anyway, it's been hugely problematic. Okay, so we've been talking about the design justice, and this is an example of design justice. That just designing your information systems. And I think we could go off on a tangent here about Foucault because this is central to Foucault's ideas that the state is about the systematization and the naming of things that previously were just things that you did, like sexuality. You just did things, and then all of a sudden we had to come up with a category: are you gay or are you straight? Um, so
And then
there's
that
that
gets
can
brought into statistics,
right, and that
and
goes into
then
all, yeah,
into now machine learning. And
yeah,
like you see it now in
algorithmic bias questions.
algorithmic bias. And so she kind of draws it just to close out that part of design justice. She draws on this like there's this long history, for it like, back way back in the day, centuries ago, really often. There are these categories created that statisticians, people who work for the government on census, originally invent or they adopt from other people who invented, and they make a particular choice based on historical needs at that time. Hispanic, white, whatever. These are constructed categories, right? They don't exist like in nature. Like we don't discover them out there in the cosmos, right?
Famously, the American Anthropological Association had decided, what, 30 years ago, that race was just not something that was legitimately empirical.
Yeah, but and even if we can determine various genetic ways in which there are genetic reasons why X, Y, and Z is true, again, we're just taking a certain set of genetic traits and associating them with the concept.
Mhm.
It's not like that has to be associated that way. There's lots of things that exist in nature, and we don't group them in a particular way because there's no need for it. Only in a society where people need to be determined by race does it make sense to even create the category. Like, and
And
I've made the same argument about gender and nationality.
relevant to transhumanism, the distinctions made between species are actually a lot fuzzier than people imagine.
Definitely.
Yeah, that you can get a different species that are allegedly separate to interbreed, and that's supposed to be the demarcation line. Okay, so we're doing design. We did design justice. Then this last week we talked about your focus, which is your dissertation focus on tech workers, and the tech workers movement, and that discussion. turned on some questions like, why do we care about workers and what a worker is and what is a worker?
Mm.
Um, and what is tech in this context? What is a tech worker in this context? Since there's tech in every workplace in the world, everyone is theoretically a tech worker, but that doesn't help if everyone is one. So why have you focused on tech workers, and why do you see this connection between tech workers and techno-progressivism, which is pretty much the focus of your thesis?
Well, I argue that the tech workers movement is a kind of you know, essentially they don't consider it this way, but I consider it to be a techno-progressive labor movement in at least in some measure because they take up questions that concern the development of technology and the development of the culture and social contexts in which technology is developed. And so it's a very socio-technical movement, which if the, again, to repeat, is like the inter entanglement of social and technological systems, the entanglement of the social context with technological contexts. And so, depending on what type of technology we have in society, we have particular social forms that can exist that don't exist in others. Like if we have platforms like Facebook, a particular social context can exist on that platform that would not exist if we didn't have Facebook or other, social media platforms. Like in the 80s, they didn't have any kind of context for what we would now consider to be the normal unfolding of social life on social media. Like it just wasn't possible. And in the other direction, particular different types of societies can produce technologies that are not possible in other social contexts. So you have to have these. So like, the type of platforms that can exist really often exist within a particular social and cultural context, like the tech firm or Silicon Valley. And when you create platforms outside of Silicon Valley, like the Fediverse, it has a very different context. And actually, the way that it's designed and the way it's governed and developed and how you interact on it is very different from the way you would govern, interact on Facebook or Instagram, right? Because one is controlled by a corporation and its employees, and the employees, of course, are following the directive of management. And the other is actually more decentralized and is governed by its users. And many of those users just happen to be also tech workers.
Mhm.
So, in the tech workers movement,
Just to expand on that connection between the socio-technical perspective and tech workers, for me, the socio-technical perspective is an attempt to get beyond the false binary of social and technological, as you said, and to
right.
acknowledge that every technology and also involves implicit knowledge, cultural practices, ways of organizing human beings around how to do that particular technology. And those are most centrally the technology workers themselves. And insofar as they're in that intersection between how things get done, as how things get done, they're the ones who understand the technology the best because they're actually designing, implementing, maintaining it. But they can also imagine different ways that it could go. And so, if the Techno Progressive Project is about trying to imagine better technological futures and how we get there, the promise of organizing directly with tech workers is that although they may have some investiture in a particular technology and and the way that they're employed, they also are the ones that would have the most interesting insights about how to move in a different direction.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And often they're both kind of struggling within the workplaces that they're in to shape the way that technology is developed inside of tech firms, and also at the same time, often literally on company time, often designing open source projects, putting out various other designs, or you know they're they're they are the people who start the alternatives often because they have the technical expertise. And they are often very critical of the firms that they work for, even though they like tech work, right? Many, this is like, a common thing that I find whenever I study when I've been studying the tech workers movement is that um, they're very optimistic about the potential of tech labor, what tech work could do, and what tech workers could do. But they're somewhat pessimistic about the tech industry and its direction. First of all, the way it has developed so far, and the way that they imagine it will continue to develop. And so, a lot of people see a kind of, you know, resist and rebuild type strategy, resist what they see as harms inside of the industry. So there's like a harm reduction kind of thinking. Like if, to give an example, if Google wants to build these, there was Project Maven. So Google and various other companies were working with the Pentagon to develop a guidance system for drones that was going to target you know, different sites in Afghanistan at the time. This was in 2017, 2018. And so a lot of people being anti-war in the tech industry tends to be, the workers especially tend to be mostly very liberal and often we would say outright progressive. When they did surveys, for instance, in 2016 and in 2020, the majority and even the supermajority in many places like where tech workers are tend to be concentrated, like New York City and San Francisco, were actually Bernie Sanders supporters. And many of them are now members of DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. So,
And Ro Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley in Congress, is co-chair of the Progressive Caucus and is promoting a social democratic platform. So,
so tech workers tend to be quite progressive, not uniformly. Of course, there are many conservatives or, people who are MAGA or whatever. But there's this way in which they see the possibility of using labor organizing to achieve these various social goals. And that was the origin of the tech workers movement really had those origins. And if you study the history of it, it's maybe not unsurprising that the people who initially began most of the institutions that became the hub of the tech workers movement, the Tech Workers Coalition, and Tech Action, which is DSA's Tech Workers Working Group. They were often people who were somewhat marginalized in the tech industry. So it tended to be like women, people of color, people who were international workers, which are actually make up a large contingent of tech workers. And there were at the time in around 2014, 2015, 2016, there was a lot of labor unrest in Silicon Valley specifically around organizing and unionizing bus drivers, um, the bus drivers, cleaners, and security guards at Silicon Valley campuses. And so there were huge victories for the labor movement all across Silicon Valley during that time, and thousands of workers who maintained and ran the buildings for Google and Amazon and others unionized. And some of those workers and the organizers who worked there reached out to tech workers who they thought would be sympathetic. And of course, they found the most sympathy amongst people who shared an identity, shared a lot of their identity with the workers who were going to go on strike. So a lot of you know, a lot of the people who were bus drivers and cleaners and security guards were people of color. A lot of cleaners are women often, and women who are um, also immigrants. And so a lot of like the women, people who were a lot of the tech workers who were women and immigrants and people of color saw that and they were like they kind of felt a solidarity with them and began to share their message with other tech workers and against the what is called typically class reductionism, which is the idea that the more your identity complicates the idea of class, and you can't see a unity of class, the less likely you are to organize in a labor struggle. This actually went in the totally opposite direction. So the workers who had these marginalized identities were the first to develop a kind of class consciousness with the workers who were service workers in the tech industry and realize that they should actually not only support these workers, but see themselves as workers, which was not common at the time. Tech workers at that time really saw themselves as creatives. They identified with the company, so they called themselves Googlers or Amazonians.
Yeah,
And
it seems like you're putting a pretty positive spin on that potential of class solidarity. And I think we need to state the other side as well, which is that, like Doug Rushkoff a decade ago wrote a book called Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus,
mhm,
which famously Google had decided, I think it was in Palo Alto or wherever their facility was, they had decided that the public transport wasn't good enough for their workers, so they were sending around a bus to pick
right,
up all their workers. And now the IPOs of the various leading AI firms are going to create all these new centimillionaires, and it's already driving up property values in
sure.
Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, and Seattle. And so we see the alienation that ordinary blue collar workers who often can't even live anywhere close to where all this is going down. They have to commute in an hour from wherever they're living. Um, and then all these workers, alleged tech workers, are making millions of bucks and have jacuzzis and massage tables in their offices, and free snacks and everything. And that breeds all this resentment. And so there is this, I think, implicit in the tech worker question is some of them must be part of what we call the professional managerial class, or they must be closely allied with the ruling classes of these firms. And some of them are not. And those are the ones who presumably have the more radicalizable potential.
Yeah, well, for sure. I lived in Silicon Valley around the time that this was going on, and I lived in a neighborhood where a lot of people worked in doing these kind of jobs that I was referring to as the service jobs in the region, and they were often being, yeah, slowly pushed out, and there was resentment for sure. But you're also correct in saying that there's not simply one monolithic tech worker, actually, and that is the point. The tech workers movement really points this out regularly in all of their talks that there's not a tech worker that is just this archetype. The tech workers have a pretty vast hierarchy, and that can exist even when it's the same job category, same job title even. So there are many divisions. Like there are the tech workers that work in the United States, for instance, and then there are tech workers who work remotely in India, Bangladesh, the Philippines,
Yeah.
and they
They're all
often do,
programmers, but
and they
some
do
of them
similar
make
jobs.
pennies. Yeah, right.
Right. And there's the division between what we would call like creatives and what is often called click workers, people who do administrative tasks like data labeling, or even worse. The worst job is probably content moderation. So, they have to determine whether this,
CSAM.
yeah, is this child abuse material? Is this a person being executed in this video? And they have to watch this stuff like all day long. And there are some really good and disturbing books about this subject. James Muldoon actually wrote a book about this, and I'm blanking on the title now. Maybe you can look it up, but
Mhm.
um, and it's really all about the workers who are typically in Nigeria and Ghana and a couple other places in Africa that they do a lot of the work, which we would say is like, I think it's often referred to as a kind of janitorial work of cyberspace. So they kind of have to clean up this mess so that it becomes a civilized place. And so they're also tech workers. They're doing this very technical work, but it's, you know,
That is important work that has to get done, and I think it's a good example of why we want to automate certain kinds of work. Because if we're going to have online content moderation, Presumably we don't want to, in the first place, some things we can't effectively moderate. That's what Facebook got in trouble for instance, encouraging the genocides in Myanmar. So they only had like, three people who spoke Burmese on their staff. And so they couldn't effectively moderate all the hate speech that was coming out of Myanmar. Um, but so we want that to be automated. And at any rate, yeah. I mean, I think there's certain kinds of psychological, and what we also have seen the downsides of automation of that, sometimes just a naked shoulder gets treated as if it's a breast or whatever, and we don't like
Yeah.
that. But that's going to happen with humans as well.
Well, that's for sure. But there's also the issue, which is brought up by many other scholars of this, which is that, automation is not 100%. So often when something is not clear, it just gets routed to a human anyway. And this occurs with simple things like, while AI is used to flag whether or not a thing is against the content policy, but then it's not quite sure, or it has below a certain threshold of certainty. And when it falls below that threshold, it gets routed to a person to verify. And then, you get an Uber and there's a problem, it gets routed to a person. And when Waymo doesn't know how to, do a K turn, then it gets routed to a person who remotely controls the car. And this is happening right now. I mean, I'm sure there are
Mhm.
thousands of Waymos right now that are being controlled by people for part of the ride. And, that's one of the main critiques of automation is that it's not as automated as it seems. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the reports, like,
Mhm.
there's all these robots on my campus, for instance, that deliver food, but then it's been shown that, well, actually, there's a number of times in which it switches to a person in the Philippines or Colombia, specific in these two countries specifically. They did studies in both of these countries where they showed how often it was routing to a person, and it's actually a person with like an Xbox controller controlling this robot. Now, of course, when you're walking around campus, you have no idea whether it's being controlled by a person or it's being controlled by its AI system, by its machine vision system. But, you know, there have been lots of people who have, and again, it's like on the one hand, it's a bit overstated, but it's overstated by maybe the critics and it's understated by the companies, right? The critics overstate how often humans do this kind of work. And they say, well, actually, all of Waymos are really just controlled by people with Xbox controllers, and there is no automation. It's just a big scam. And the company is apt to say, well, there's occasionally a time, it's very rare, but sometimes when it's raining and there's one of the sensors is blocked, it goes to a person, but actually most of the time it's AI or it's, machine vision or whatever. And so,
But the fact that there are humans involved, for me is a little bit optimistic because John Scalzi, for instance, he wrote a novel a decade ago called Head On about a future in which lots of people have degenerative neurological disease that leaves them bedridden, but they're able to teleoperate and bodies, 3D robots, humanoid robots in the workplace, and have a productive life through these robots. And I just saw that there's now a cafe in Tokyo that's doing exactly that, that has people who can only control robots with a puff of breath or blinking or whatever, but they're actually serving food and taking orders in restaurants with humanoid robots. So, I
hmm,
mean, I think I'm a little bit more open-minded to the idea that, okay, yes, there's still human labor involved in some of these allegedly automated processes, but that could be a good thing.
yeah, well, I mean, it depends. It would be a good thing if the workers are treated well and, are paid decently. The problem is that they are, in this case, they're not paid well. That's
Yeah.
that's mainly the issue, and that's the main critique, and that's why the tech workers movement is necessary for that. Um, and the tech workers movement is global, and often it's not exactly cohesive. Like the ghost worker, click worker movement is a bit separate and is more associated with the gig workers movement than the tech workers movement, even though gig workers are also a kind of tech worker. Um, or at least there's a lot of interconnection between them. And also some tech workers are actually also gig workers. Like
Hmm.
not only are they also gig workers because they drive Uber, but they work on gig platforms. They work on Fiverr, they work on various other things to do piecework.
TaskRabbit. I think of
Yeah,
task people who are
Rabbit.
basically they have technical skills that they gigify.
Yeah. And there's this whole, yeah, exactly. So they gigify those skills. Tech companies rely on that, and also individual companies rely on this kind of lower paid, informal kind of economy to get their tech labor needs met. And then there's this whole other thing, which is the divide between people who are full-time professionals on contract, that get benefits, they get, the catered meals, they get, 401k, etc. And then there are other people who work at Google, work at, Oracle, wherever, that are called temps, vendors, and contractors, and the TVCs, which is a big divide in Silicon Valley. That was one of the rupture points that launched the tech workers movement as well, because a lot of people who were actually highly skilled, people who were software engineers, were like, wait a minute. So the full-time engineers are getting like 150 to $200,000 a year. But then we have these TBCs that are getting paid half, a quarter of that amount of money, and they're on 3 month, 6 month contracts. And
Well,
or, maybe they're getting paid well, but they don't
well,
have any job security.
this is one of the huge ironies, and another reason for techno-progressives to focus on tech workers is that over the last 4 years, contrary to every expectation we had before that, it's in fact the people who are doing computer programming who have been the subject of gigification, of precarity, of
Mhm.
automation, more even than blue collar workers who we thought might be the most vulnerable. So yeah, they are seeing they're both the implementers of the automation program, but also its first victims. And so they obviously have a lot of important things to think about it. Okay,
And
so
specifically, yeah.
yeah, so we did tech workers. Again, everyone is invited to continue to participate in our course and in our discussions. You don't have to have done the previous readings. And what we're going to be doing for the second half of the course is more about the contemporary politics of the techno-progressive and transhumanist ideas in the 20th century and the 21st century. So the rise of libertarian transhumanism, singularitarianism, my own intervention with democratic transhumanism, and then how it relates to issues of bioconservatism, what are posthumanists, and so things like that. So, what are some of the key things that you want people to draw out of the second half of the course?
Yeah, those are some really interesting topics. And the, genealogy of transhumanism is really interesting. Its various histories and the kinds of questions that each one of the tendencies in transhumanism centers is really interesting. And I think democratic transhumanism and techno-progressivism are a bit different from the what I would consider to be more deterministic libertarian school. I think a lot of people in that school are more accelerationist, and they see technology as more inevitable, and the trajectory is more fixed and predictable than I see it, and that I think most techno progressives see it as. And that leads to a very different approach to how we think about emerging technologies and their development. Like, if you think that technology has a more or less fixed and deterministic trajectory, then if you think that trajectory is good, then really what you're trying to do is step out of the way and accelerate it. And that's really your only role. But if you think that technology is more open than that, and that the design and development and governance of tech explicitly and meaningfully shapes its development, then you would have a very different, disposition, and you would think that there are many ways in which things can go better and many ways that they can go worse. And, we don't know in advance what the best path is, but we want to try and, you know, I always argue, we should strive toward a kind of progressive knowledge about our path that gives us better insights as we move and allows us to move more in a progressive direction. And we don't know that in advance. Like we can't know in advance what is going to unfold in 2040, 2050. We can make, kind of predictions, but those predictions only determine what we do right now. They're not really pictures of the future. They just determine how we should act now. If we think we're on a dystopian trajectory, we can kind of think through what would happen if we don't mitigate it and we don't try to steer it the other way. And we can look at history and say, like, here's what people did in the past to move something that was going in the wrong direction back onto the track that we consider progressive. Um, and here's how things went wrong, and here's how things went better. And, here are the different tendencies that existed, and let's try and like use some of those lessons and think through how we can gather knowledge today to determine our present position and where we want to go. And
This is
that's
an important
imperfect,
point
but
because technoprogressivism is closely tied to futurism as a movement or
right.
futurology, and not futurism in the Italian sense,
Yeah.
although there are some ties there too. But futurology, and I think
In
one
the
of the
sense.
yeah, one of the interesting problems in the history of all future studies or all historiography really is unilinearity, teleology, versus having a more open approach to to chaos. That history is chaos, and for me, I think it's important that technoprogressives recognize that within left thought, like within Marxism, there has been a teleological and deterministic and unilinear set of views, and there's also within left thought a more open set of views. So when Marx started to think about Asian despotism, it's like, well, maybe not every society goes through the same stages of feudalism, capitalism, socialism that I think is going to happen here in the West. Um, but for us, it has to be that the future possibilities range from apocalypse, existential disaster for the entire human race, to some truly utopian possibilities. And we're trying to steer from one to the other, but we don't have a strong brief that we are certain that it's going to end in one particular place or another. We
Right.
think everything's possible.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. And it does point to the way that I think about socialism as well, which is very similar. Like you had brought up before that Bogdanov was part of the God Builders, and that's true, but then he broke with the God Builders, which is like Maxim Gorky and Anatolia Lunacharsky and others, um, because he came to not to even though he was he was pretty Promethean, but he really understood clearly that we can't fully know what we need to know in order to shape the future. And so he took a more open approach and really fell and he began to move more into the what I would call like the school of emergence or radical imminence, which is the idea that we we don't actually have a we don't the future is not teleological. We can't know it in advance. We can't produce a society in our mind that we like build, that we actualize. That's very idealist, and it's not based on any kind of real concrete things in the world. It's not based on materiality. And the problem with the materiality of human beings is that it's just too nonlinear to know its full direction. So we can't really know what the best course is. We can only try to develop a society that enables emergence to unfold progressively. And so he wouldn't have called himself progressive. That term was associated with a very particular movement in America at the time, and also England or the Anglo world. And actually, progressivism didn't become a global movement until kind of recently. It was associated mostly with a very particular way of thinking about developing cities. But I don't think of progressivism strictly speaking as like a set of principles or policies so much as like the idea that we want to be able to produce the conditions that allow us to keep moving forward and to develop the kind of feedback that allows us at each step as we move toward what we imagine, right? Like we can create future visions and all these things, but we want to keep them loose in our minds, right? The horizon should always be fuzzy. That's like a really important thing about radical imminence and emergence is that even though we have we have futurism and what is typically called futuring, where you imagine futures and you think of what is an ideal future or a um, like a desirable future, and we try to chart out and think about how we can get to those futures. We try to think about the path that leads to them, but we always are humble in our we are epistemically humble. We're humble in our knowledge. Our knowledge is always incomplete. We can only look backward at history to determine how we get forward, but we know that history is not a perfect mirror of the future. Whatever people did in the past is not a perfect mirror of what we'll do in the future.
Which is pretty
Just
central to the contemporary technoprogressive, transhumanist, futurist worldview because of singularity. The idea that we're the observation that where there's technological acceleration. Not everybody accepts that, but I think I generally accept that there's technological acceleration, and that technological acceleration means that we will reach um, future possibilities and ruptures and black swan events that we can't
Mhm.
even currently imagine very quickly. And as a consequence, the future becomes less and less predictable. So I think that that's a broadly accepted tenet in our field. But as you say, the course is called Technoprogressive Worldbuilding precisely because we want people to say, look, in this open set of future possibilities, we can feel a certain liberation from the fact that previous generations of leftists, progressives, social dreamers, whatever, would have said, well, how feasible is it? Like Marx in the 19th century, he was basically saying to people, look, we want a certain kind of society, but we probably have 50 or 60 years of technological development to do before we get to the place where we could have enough workers, enough factories, enough material prosperity to have the kind of society that we want. So this is a long-term project. And you can't just like Bakunin or Bloodkey or whoever, you can't just have a revolution today and say, okay, one and done, we now have the new society.
Right.
And so as a consequence, I think we're at the point where we can say, look, new things that we used to think were 50-year projects might be amenable to society in 5 or 10 years because of all the things that are happening. The
Right.
degree of technological unemployment, the destruction, the completely unexpected destruction of the global geopolitical order, and the rise of a new geopolitical order. All of these things are opening up possibility at the same time that they're scary as hell. So
Definitely.
again, I want to invite people to join us for this discussion with Technoprogressive Worldbuilding, but I wanted to close on the fact that this has been generative for you of thinking about a technoprogressive philosophy of knowledge, and you put up your first essay on that, The View from the Peak, at Bread and Robots. And I just wanted you to say some things about what you mean by philosophy of knowledge and why you think a technoprogressive philosophy of knowledge is a good idea.
Well, I was just trying to what I mean by so Bogdanov creates this image of viewing things from the peak, and what he means is like the peak of our understanding of reality. And he's really like thinking about how we get to that we develop the right methods and that we can develop a sufficient enough knowledge of what's happening in the field that we're considering, like in this case, the development of technology and its unfolding or its governance. And we need to develop a concrete and material understanding of a number of things if we want to be able to guide these developments in a progressive direction. So we need to develop what I would say is a progressive form of knowledge. And that's a little different from saying that it is a knowledge of progressivism, right? A lot of people, when I ask, when I talk about techno-progressivism, that people just take the two words and they're like, okay, so techno and progressivism. So you're effectively saying you want to apply the principles of the progressive movement, either social, I mean, typically like they think of AOC or they think of the Green New Deal, they think of Bernie Sanders, which I would say they're social democrats. They call themselves democratic socialists. There's some distinction, but I don't think we're really at the point where it needs to be worked out so fully yet.
I'm delighted by how many people are trying to figure that out these days. It's like, okay, so what exactly do you mean by socialism, Mr. Whoever they're talking about?
Yeah. And it is now it's a growing movement. And I think, it's not entirely wrong to think that. Like, we want to apply certain progressive principles to the development of technology. That's true. So insofar as like progressivism is concerned with anti-racism and it's concerned with, you know, developing um, a less gendered society, developing a society that overcomes poverty, that doesn't have, you know, all of these kinds of injustices and various types of oppression. That's all true. I think that we do have those values, but progressive knowledge is a little different from that. It doesn't specifically mean like taking on the progressive platform, which is historical. Like in the future, we might not consider this to be the progressive platform. That might not be enough for progressives in the future. If if progressivism succeeds and it gets to the next stage where it needs to do more, where it needs to do other things to be considered the progressive rather than just the centrist point of view, these could come to be regressive policies. We might think of redistribution as as something of a compromise versus like, more socialist demands like workers controlling industry or developing, an ecosystem of cooperatives, for instance. That's like one of the intermediate socialist demands that was tried in the 20th century in various contexts. So that's something historical and sort of like not something that is really it's not a method. So progressive knowledge is something different. Progressive knowledge is really something that attempts to stake out um, knowledge about the world that is sufficient enough to move us forward in our thinking about the world. So effectively, like it gives us feedback that we're able to use at each stage as we keep moving toward this horizon that we imagine to determine, first of all, whether we're going in the right direction with a thing and allows us to consider course corrections and again keep us humble in our epistemics. Like we might move toward a thing and realize it's not the right direction, not the right thing, or maybe we need to slow down and get more data. Maybe we don't have enough of a picture of where we're going and it's
Yeah, when I
not
think
clear.
about techno-progressive epistemology, like I recently gave this talk about world government and started with the notion that if our ethics are founded on sentient beings having sympathy for one another, that also has an implicit epistemic critique or critique of our a point of view about what a virtuous epistemology would be. So in other words, being self understanding of our class biases, our racial biases, our gender biases. That was where I started actually when I started critiquing the transhumanist movement. I said, look, we're a bunch of white guys between the ages of 20 and 35 at that time, who are affluent and mostly in computer professions or highly educated professions in the West. And so that brings with it a whole bunch of baggage that we need to unpack about why this perspective, why we're not sufficiently critical of the eugenics movement or whatever it is. But then it also relates to Sidgwick and what he said that a utilitarian should take the perspective of the universe. That in order to be truly impartial about the world and not say, I'm okay, I know that there's other people in the world, but I'm mostly concerned with Americans or I'm mostly concerned with Israelis or whoever it is, to truly have a global perspective on where is this whole global civilization headed. And so for me, that's why I'm always very critical, not only of my class and other situational biases, but also of the kind of information that I'm taking in about the world. Am I paying enough attention to Africa, to Southeast Asia, or whatever?
That's a great point. I totally agree. And that that's exactly what I mean by progressive knowledge. And also what I was meaning by objective knowledge, which is a form of utilitarianism. And I would say Bogdanov and others were they were pretty utilitarian. They argued that the purpose of philosophy is to organize our thoughts about the world, to align those thoughts with what we can consider to be a socially verified reality, which is to say, like an accurate picture of reality as it stands today. But again, this is where we bring in world building and why he always said that our kind of species being, right, to use Marx's phrase, or the purpose of humanity, our meaning, the meaning of life, essentially, is that we're world builders. So we don't just want to understand reality only to contemplate it, but to change it. But we want to change it from a perspective that is like complete enough that it includes all these perspectives that may not be our own perspective from where we are born. What's typically in feminism called your standpoint, right? You're born, and again, like you have a PhD. I'm about to have a PhD. I would consider myself highly educated, well read, relatively, kind of middle class to upper middle class, and socially ascendant, economically ascendant, and living in the United States, and all these things, right? So my standpoint cannot be universal. Now, no one's standpoint can be universal, of course, and that's not the point of it. The point is not that anyone can actually be the universal in some sense, but that knowledge can be more or less universal, maybe not perfectly universal, to be clear, right? We cannot perfectly embody every perspective so clearly that it could be considered really the perspective of the universe. But
Right. That's a chimera as well. Yeah, it's something that we could chase but never really achieve.
yeah, it's like a Carnot engine. Like we can try to achieve 100%. Just a Carnot engine is like 100% efficiency. Every bit of power, every bit of energy is converted to work. That's not actually possible in reality. And just like we can't really 100% know what is universally true in any given time or place, but we can strive toward universality by taking in as many perspectives as possible.
But
And
but you know
doing
the
so, we
other
can
the other
have,
thing that this makes me think about is the importance of people being part of movements and organizations, because the
right.
way that you construct a movement, an organization, a federal agency, or whatever, is also a structuring of the epistemology that you're going to be bringing to the table. You know, do you have sufficient numbers of people of diverse races in your organization so that you're sensitive to all those different issues? And if you don't, are you sufficiently critical of the fact that you have that bias? So, you know, this has been a long discussion on the left, often self-laceration, liberal white guilt about it. But it's as true for white organizations as it is for African American organizations. I mean, every organization has its own epistemological biases.
That's definitely true. And those epistemologies, like, you know, like knowledge is always interconnected. What is the Marxist phrase is that social knowing and social being are absolutely entangled, right? Like what we know is also what we are in effect, right? Like so like to like say it socially is to say from your standpoint, if you know that low taxes are good, but and like forced busing is bad or whatever, to use like a classic American example around segregation, that is a kind of knowledge that exists depending on who you are in society. And so that's like your social being as a person, as effectively as a white person in a particular historical context where integration is the question, determines your knowledge, and your knowledge determines your being. However, if you cross and at that, say in the 1960s, those people who were quote cross the color line and began to, have conversations with and organize with Black people and vice versa, and to build a multiracial movement, began to think of multiracial democracy. which was much more universal. Not only because it included more people from different places, but because new forms of knowledge could come about. Those new forms of knowledge also were tied with new forms of being. Now we're not just like two different kinds of people, like as if we're from different planets coming into contact with each other. Now we're sharing the same spaces, we're having conversations, we're sharing friendships, maybe eventually sharing families as people begin to form interracial families, different interracial communities, and they begin to share interests, right? So what you know determined also where you belonged and it determined who you became. So in a multiracial society, we tend to like think of becoming in a particular way. We think of belonging in a particular way that's very different from a very segregated society. In a segregated society, belonging is based on race, right? And in a multiracial society, it has to be based on something different from race, right? Maybe it's based on a shared set of values, maybe it's based on nationality or something else, but effectively something is more universal. The the more it doesn't create like rigid categories and hierarchies. It doesn't like separate people based on these binaries, which are often false binaries. And that is really interconnected with knowledge. Like the more you can reach out into the universe effectively, like to use your image and say like I may not be trans, but I can read and become friends with and build networks with trans people. And those people can come into my organization or I could talk to them on X. I can, read books that's from a trans perspective and I can think about technology and development through that perspective. It's not my standpoint because I'm not a trans person, but I can incorporate that into how I think about technology and development and culture. And that's like really interconnected because now it can become more universal. So progressive knowledge is often really more like we're really trying to amplify the signal, right? And to try and filter out the noise. We want to create feedback that allows us to create an ever more progressive and universal way of thinking about things. So techno-progressive, of course, includes all of those ways in which those ways of thinking, those kinds of cultures and belongings get embodied in systems and technologies that then feed back on us and change us, right?
Mhm.
In our platforms, in the way we build cities, in how we move around in the world, and the interconnection between those different types of embodiments, right? Like people who
I,
design technology on one platform are going to do differently than on another platform, and they're going to come in contact with different people and have different cultures, right?
right. Yeah,
That's
yeah. Apparently, 2 weeks on X is more likely to make you conservative than on any other platform or something like that. By the way, I saw an interview recently with a pollster, and it was a debate between a political activist and a pollster in this case. And the political activist was like, why aren't Americans more angry about the people that ICE has killed in the last 2 weeks? This guy in Maine and some of the other folks. And the pollster said, look, I talk to people every day and they just don't know about it. And it's like, but they should know about it. And it's like, okay, but we're all busy people in the world. And there's lots of things we should know about. I mean, how much does the average person know about the Uyghur genocide? How much do they know about what's going on in Myanmar, et cetera? We all should know. And this is one of the reasons why I think that the burdens of being a citizen in the first place, but especially the epistemic burdens of
right.
recognizing the biases in your episteme and trying to overcome those in some systematic way to be more virtuously knowledgeable about the world, that this really requires us to have robust agentic systems that will tell us, don't click on that, that's misinformation.
Mm.
Do pay attention to this. I know that you're not interested in what's happening in Botswana, but that's really important for you to know about this today. And we used to rely on editors and trust the news journals. The what do they say about the New York Times? The journal of record.
Paper record, yeah.
Yeah. But now I think we have the potential to have personally crafted epistemes in ways that I've been experimenting with personally. By the way, I also put out a call today for anyone who is interested, and if you've made it this far in this interview, you might be one of these people interested in writing about Silo Season 3's use of memory drugs, which is kind of related to this. In the last episode of Silo season 3, which I think is episode 2, um, they are unrolling that how they got these silos, which are now 300 years old, how they have been maintaining social order in them. And one of the key things that they do is that they make people forget the past. And the psychiatrist who's rolling it out in the present to treat PTSD of soldiers, he says, look, I can erase a soldier's past, and then we open it back up and we slowly reintroduce them and tell them a story about themselves. And the guy says, well, what if I tell them lies? And he says, well, why would you want to do that? And it's like, because that's what society is. It's telling people stories in the interest of somebody else and not you. But at any rate, I think it's a very rife with implications metaphor that Silo has introduced. And of course, it's also
Yeah.
based on the books. So if anyone wants to write that essay for the IET Substack, please do.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point about narratives and stories, and it again it ties back to Bogdanov's argument that reality is socially organized experience. Reality does not exist in an absolute sense, right? What we call reality depends very intimately on the kinds of myths we tell, stories we tell, what information and knowledge we have about the world, what is accessible to us. And again, like where are we in climbing the peak? What are we seeing, you know? And I like to give the example, I was just explaining this to somebody yesterday. They were asking me about what I meant. And I said, there's what you see from the base of the Sandias, which is the mountain range that's in Albuquerque, is a partial picture of the city. The farther up you go on the peak, the more of the city you see, right? And only when you get to the very top can you see the other side of the peak, which means your picture doubles in the last less than 1% of the journey. So, you know, you have to this creates a number of problems for how we think about epistemics. It tells us that most people have a very impartial picture of reality and that somebody else's has to be filling in the blanks. Like if if reality requires us to know about the whole picture and yet we can't see the whole picture ourselves, somebody else is filling in the blanks, right? They're producing that picture for us, and only a tiny number of people have ever seen the 360 view, right? Which is why he brings up Copernicus as really the foil to the concept of democratization, which is the idea that democratization and objectivity and social experience has nothing to do whatsoever with being popular or following the going with the flow or following what is the common view at the time. It's often a very niche and lonely view. You're you're able to take in more or in our world typically an institution or a group of people, but often a tiny group of people. And again, like I want to be, it would be not so humble to say that we're that group of people, but we strive to be, right? In this group of people that can see the view from the top, and then from that view understand what reality is and be able at our given time, because we can only see from one mountain, but maybe in the future we'll be able to see from other mountains.
Mhm.
So, and guide things in that way. But like you're saying with these characters on Silo, like, what we consider reality is highly constructed. It always is, but like how much knowledge we have and what our field of experience is determines whether our reality, what is reality, what is normal, what is true, is a vast field that includes a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience across many different standpoints, or whether it's really insular and our reality is QAnon posts.
I'll close with a quote from Simone Weil, who said that history is a deposition filed by assassins about their victims, which I always thought was the darkest epistemological observation. I've been talking with Matteo McDermott, who is our bread and robots contributor at IEET, fellow of the IEET, and also teaching our summer technoprogressive world building course. I invite people again to join us for the second half of the world building course. We're meeting on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. EST. And you can contact me, director at IET.org, and Matteo at Matteo at IET.org about the course and how to sign up for it. Have a good week, Matteo. This has been fun. Everything seems to be moving along swimmingly in society. Trump is preparing to cancel the next election on the grounds that China has undermined our electoral systems. I'm sure we'll be having to talk about that in the future. And of course, all of our ideas have been declared terrorism threats. So we'll probably have to talk about that at some point as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been good. And hopefully Trump's talk continues. I saw the headline, Trump has followed a shock and bore strategy.
I know.
So hopefully it continues to bore all of his supporters and it amounts to nothing.
I mean, when I look back at all the anxiety I had about Trumpian fascism, I'm still anxious, but it's been so much more boring and stupid than I ever imagined it could be. And so that's been a consolation, I suppose. Okay,
Yeah.
well, we'll be back next week, same time. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye. The Technoprogressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Technoprogressives.